for case number 12 CFA 1083, State of Florida versus George Zimmerman. And are we ready to proceed?
I believe so, Your Honor. We're just getting the connection made with the first witness. It should take a couple of minutes or less.
Okay. No, I think...
Yes, I can.
Good news.
May I proceed? Yes, sir. Good morning, Dr. French. Let me do a brief test first. Can you hear me and see me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
That's on purpose. You can't see it, so you can see it.
All right, well, let's do a bit of a level test. I guess we're not going to have a two-way video link, but we can see you. And so let's, if we might, Judge, just see if we can all hear each other. Would you... And let's just do a level test. If you would just say something that we can hear at this end. Just
One,
introduce
two, three.
yourself, please.
Good morning. My name is Peter French, and I'm speaking to you from the UK.
All right, thank you. Is that acceptable?
If we could have it a little louder.
How do we do that?
I think on your control. Okay. I'm at max now. Dr. French, can you say one more thing for us?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yes, sir. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Your Honor, the practice has been so far with witnesses appearing by video that the court has sworn them in.
Right. Sarah, if you'll please stand up and raise your right hand to be sworn.
Dr. French, would you raise your right hand to be sworn, please? I doubt it, if you can hear you.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall present will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're all set now. Would you please introduce yourself to the court?
Yes, my name is John Peter French.
And what is your business or occupation?
I'm a forensic consultant specializing in the analysis of speech samples.
And do you have a company or professional organization under which you do this work?
Yes, I do. I'm the chairman of JP French Associates, which is an independent forensic speech and audio laboratory based in York in the UK.
Are you now in York? Is that where you are as we speak?
Indeed, I'm in my lab.
Would you, let me preface this by saying, Dr. French, you previously provided a summary curriculum vitae to me.
Yes, correct.
And I have now provided it to Mr. Manti of the State Attorney's Office, as well as filed a copy of it with the court. Has the court received it?
I have it all.
Okay. So let's talk about that document for a moment first. Does the CV generally outline your current position, as you've described it, and some of your professional experience?
It does, yes.
Would you describe then generally what is the work that you do and how long have you been doing it?
I was first consulted in 1981, and since the late 1980s, I've been doing this more or less full-time, except that I also have responsibilities for the supervision of research and for lecturing at the University of York here in the UK. The work, the forensic work that I do, involves analysing recordings for judicial purposes and also for investigative purposes. A large proportion of that work is forensic speaker comparison, which is sometimes known as voice identification.
Dr. French, what is your formal education and training in human speech or related areas?
I have a postgraduate degree from the University of Manchester in linguistics with phonetics. I have a PhD in the analysis of recorded conversation from the University of Bristol. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Acoustics. I'm the president of the International Association for Forensic Phonetics and Acoustics, which is a professional organization that oversees work in this area. I'm also a fellow of the International Society for Phonetic Sciences and various other learned bodies. I am honorary professor in the Department of Language and Linguistic Science at the University of York, and I'm an editor of the International Journal of Speech, Language and the Law. I'm also chairman of a group set up by the government, by the Home Office here in the UK, which I was asked to establish and convene, which is to do with the regulation of this area and bringing it under government regulation. I've been involved over the years in somewhere near 5,000 cases, maybe a little over that, and given evidence in courts more than 200 times. Consultations have been from countries all over the world: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, lots of European ones. Courts including the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. I was involved in the case brought against the former Yugoslavian leader, Slobodan Milosevic. Currently, my laboratory, when I say my laboratory, we're 7 full-time members of staff and 1 part-time. We handle between 100 and 200 cases each year. We like to say that in criminal cases we're very even-handed and will act evenly for the prosecution and the defence. But the disposition of work is simply that there's more prosecution work than defence work. So I'd say somewhere between 70 and 80% of our work in the UK is for the prosecution or the police rather than for the defence.
If I heard you correctly, you said 70 to 80% of your forensic work is at the request of the prosecution, typically?
Yes.
Have you given testimony in courts of law as an expert in your field?
Yes, around about 200 times.
Yes, and in what jurisdictions generally?
New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, the UK, which is split into 3 different jurisdictions, consultations right across the globe.
Have you had occasion to be involved professionally in cases in the United States?
Only 2 to my recollection, and I think one was a civil matter which hasn't progressed to a court or a tribunal, and the other was for an internal, it was an internal investigation within a private body, a private organisation.
In your professional capacity, have you been called upon to train others in your field?
Yes, I have. I do this as part of my work here at the lab, JP French Associates. We train junior members of staff. I've also put on course for the colleague, a week long for, in the US in fact, for the US Secret Service and the FBI in Washington.
Was that a training session where you were invited to travel to the US to train the attendees at this course?
Yes, it was to educate them into the methods that we use in our work.
You mentioned a moment ago that you have a relationship with the University of York.
Yes.
What is your position there, and does that relate to the same kind of work that you do in your lab?
Yes, it does. It's an honorary position. I'm an honorary professor, but that is not just a passive role, it's an active role. I'm involved in the supervision of half a dozen PhD students, and I also help design and implement with a colleague an MSc degree, that's a Master of Science degree in Forensic Speech Science for postgraduate students, to introduce them to the sort of work that I do professionally.
Would that work include supervising PhD students' work in support of their dissertation or graduate degrees in specific speaker identification or voice comparison research?
All of my, well, no, that's not true. Most of my PhD supervision responsibilities are towards people working in forensic speech science, yes.
Have you yourself been published?
Yes, I've published quite widely in professional journals and book chapters.
Have you participated in research that has resulted in publications of that research?
Oh, yes.
Over your career, can you estimate approximately the number of your publications in the forensic area?
Oh, gosh.
If you have your summary CV in front of you, feel free to reference it if it will help.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'll have to do that.
Sure.
Thanks. Sorry, if you just give me a moment. I haven't got the specific number, going on towards 30.
Have you also co-authored some of these papers with other recognized experts in your area?
Yes, indeed.
You mentioned your laboratory. I think you said you have 7 staff, is that correct?
Including myself, 7 full-time staff, yeah.
And is that the staff that works with you in doing voice comparison and other forensic work when requested by law enforcement or private counsel?
6 of us are. One of us is the manager. One person holds an administrative post, but the rest of us are scientific staff.
In addition to the scholarly work that you've done, as well as the forensic work, do you also have editorial responsibilities with some of the recognized journals in this area?
Yes, I'm an editor of the International Journal of Speech, Language and the Law, with responsibilities for articles on forensic phonetics and forensic acoustics. In addition to which, I'm on the editorial board of a journal called Loquens, Spanish Journal of Speech Sciences, and also an advisory board member of, well, more a magazine than a journal actually, Bring to bring findings about linguistics to the wider public, something called Babel, which is a magazine about language.
Have you also presented at conferences, in addition to some of the training work that you've done, where you've had occasion to meet other members of the relevant scientific community?
Oh, very frequently, yes.
Is making those presentations and attending them a regular part of your professional work?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's part of my continuing professional development. And a way of me contributing to the field from my research findings and my casework.
Is it important to you in the work that you do to stay current as to the methodologies available for voice comparison?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Are you experienced and trained in those methodologies?
Yes.
Have you used those methodologies in your own work?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the guidelines and standards in this scientific community for voice comparison work?
There are lots of guidelines. Some of them, well, most of them are local guidelines specific to particular jurisdictions. But yes, I'm familiar with a range of them.
Could we talk generally about the subject matter of voice comparison?
Yes.
And as you explain that to us, please relate any work that you've done personally or studies that you know of professionally that identify or recognize this aspect of the work. So why don't we start with something as simple as this. When your lab receives a recording and you are asked to analyze it for voice comparison purposes, what are the initial steps that you would take?
Well, the initial steps are preparatory ones. What they would normally involve is making a record of all the exhibit references, logging the exhibits, be they CDs, DVDs, or whatever, onto a computer system, the date of receipt, who they were received from, the method of delivery, and so on. From there, they would be logged on to the system, and the next step towards an analysis would be to re-record the contents to a computer server, where they would be stored as standard data, audio data files for further analysis. Once that was done, an initial appraisal would be carried out to see if the material was going to be suitable for the purposes for which it had been submitted.
In that regard, are there some basic guidelines that you employ to determine whether the material is indeed suitable for further forensic analysis?
Yes, there are. I mean, we take into account three major things. The first thing is, are the samples going to be adequate in terms of sound quality? And we would carry out a sound quality evaluation of them to look at things such as levels of background noise, contamination, the bandwidth of the signal. We would also be looking at the duration of the recordings to see if there was an adequate representation of speech sounds there for a reliable comparison to be carried out. And thirdly, one thing which complicates it rather, we would be looking at just how distinctive or unusual the voice patterns of the person in question appeared to be from an initial examination. Now, there's probably a couple of things I should outline here. Firstly, what we can't do, and which we resist doing in my practice, is to specify an absolute minimum in terms of sound quality, however that's defined in terms of signal to noise ratio, or indeed in terms of duration, either defined as the number of words or the length in seconds. And the reason for that is the feature that I'd already mentioned, which is the distinctiveness of the voice. Sometimes if somebody has very unusual speech features or voice features, for instance, voice pathology or speech impediments, it is possible to get a result out of the recordings despite relatively poor quality and despite very brief samples. The other thing I should mention is that use of the samples for identification and for elimination purposes is not symmetrical. So whilst you might need quite a bit more speech and better quality speech for identification purposes, for elimination, if the voices are very different, for example, in terms of accent, in terms of pitch, or in terms of timbre, sometimes it's possible to do an elimination on much less speech and poorer quality speech than that needed for an identification. So this is quite complex, and I think my personal view is to specify for most methods. There are exceptions to this. The biometric method is an exception to this, but for most methods of examination, I think it's not possible to specify a minimum of either in terms of sound quality or duration for analysis.
If I understand you correctly, then that the emphasis is on the quality of the recording,
Yeah.
and specific aspects of the recording that you're being asked to evaluate rather than a bright line rule simply on the length of the recording.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So with reference to quality, what are the issues there, and what do you look for in determining suitability?
Well, whether or not it's possible to get a clear picture of how the person pronounces individual consonant sounds, individual vowel sounds, whether you can adequately analyze the timbre of their voice, what we call the voice quality, or whether contaminating noise, extraneous noise, precludes some of the examinations which we would deem to be necessary. We would also look to see whether the recordings were comparable in terms of, if you like, modality of speech. So, for instance, it's very difficult to compare something like whispering with normal voice or shouting with normal voice. So in terms of quality, they would be the sorts of parameters that we were attending to.
Speaking of shouting, for example, are there particular problems in evaluating for voice comparison purposes sound samples that are shouts or contain shouts?
Yes, there are. For instance, when people shout, I mean, we have to realize that shouting is not simply speaking made louder. People adopt completely different vocal settings when they shout to when they speak. And it is very difficult if somebody is genuinely shouting rather than just speaking on rather raised voice to do a comparison. I mean, I would say that of the material submitted to my lab, somewhere around perhaps 10-15% of cases are rejected as unsuitable for comparison purposes. So they're screened out before the analysis stage. And in fact, that number is probably an underestimate, in the sense that what we'll often get are telephone calls or email requests from potential clients, from police officers or solicitors, who will be describing the samples to us. And on the basis of our reaction to their description, for instance, if they're asking us to compare, say, the shouting of a bank robber who's demanding money from bank staff over the counter, just a few shouted utterances, with a person speaking at normal level in an interview, our reaction to that might cause them not to submit the recording in the first place. So it's about 10-15% of those that are submitted we reject as unsuitable, but we probably fend off a larger number of requests for analysis before the tapes or the CDs or whatever actually get here.
Is it generally accepted by you, your lab, and more broadly in the scientific community that shouting or screaming samples are not suitable for voice comparison?
Yes. I've never come across a case in the 30 years of my career where anybody's attempted to compare screaming, for instance, with normal voice.
Are you aware of any studies where people look specifically at that issue, whether you are able to do reliable voice comparison where the unknown voice is screaming?
I don't know of any studies that specifically address that issue. There are studies which look at the differences between shouting and speech, and I would say it's pretty much just axiomatic within the community that you can't compare screaming with speech.
In your lab, if someone gave you a voice sample where the unknown voice was obviously shouting or screaming or crying in some way, crying out in some way, would you find that extremely difficult, if not impossible, to analyze?
Yes.
Is there some research that you are aware of that's specifically being done on people that are shouting or crying out in obvious distress, as opposed to shouting for attention, obvious in distress, the life-threatening situation or the death cry that's sometimes been described?
Yes, I've just, I have a PhD student who has just completed her PhD, which is specifically on that topic. She took, if you like, distress cries from people who are in extreme pain or who are in fact in extremis, about to die or have been fatally wounded or are in fear of their lives, from real forensic recordings which have been submitted to my lab over the years, and she analysed the properties of those and compared them where it was possible. If there was a sample of speech from the same person at normal voice levels, she looked at the differences between the, if you like, the death cries, the extreme distress cries, and the normal speech of the person.
Was the research at all encouraging that this can be done, or that can even move toward being done?
She didn't look specifically at the issue of whether you could compare the two for speaker identification purposes, but the results of her study, if one were to extrapolate from them, would be clearly towards the fact that you can't, because the way that people react in those situations is very, very unpredictable. You can't say from someone's normal voice what they're going to sound like when they're under severe attack. And similarly, if you had a recording of somebody who's under severe attack, you can't work backwards from that to the properties of their normal speaking voice.
Let's talk about that more specifically for a moment. The first part is that, are you saying it's unpredictable how one's voice might react or change as a result of someone being in dire straits?
Yeah, I mean, there are some general tendencies. For instance, that people, their pitch goes up. The extent to which it goes up is very, very variable. There are some cases where it goes up only by a factor of about 4, and there are other cases where it would go up to by a factor of about 9 or 10. So you can't actually say just how far the pitch is going to be raised when somebody is in a situation like that. The other thing is that the lower vowel resonances are also raised, but the degree to which they're raised, again, is unpredictable and variable from speaker to speaker. One thing that does happen is that the timbre of the voice, what we call the voice quality, can't in any way be analysed from screaming.
In addition to the changes on the voice itself, would typically voices that are screaming or yelling out limit other voice characteristics that might typically be used in voice comparison?
Oh, absolutely. If you listen to someone screaming, even if there are words there, even if you can be sure there are words there, and very often you can't, the way that the vowels are screamed is very, very different. I mean, it's a well-known feature which is repeatedly reported in research, that when someone's shouting or screaming, the vowels get longer, but the actual quality of the vowels changes as well. Consonant sounds lack all definition, you can't compare those. I mean, if I could maybe just loop back a little bit and tell you a bit about how we routinely carry out the analysis and the comparison of samples in the laboratory, the specific parameters that we analyze them on, and then I could maybe tell you which ones you can still examine if someone's yelling and which ones you can't.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Generally, the method that we carry out, and which is very, very prevalent, in fact, having recently carried out, I've had a PhD student, another one carry out a survey of voice comparison practices internationally. Of the people, I think she surveyed about 40-something analysts from different countries. 75% of them used the combined auditory phonetic and acoustic phonetic method. If I could explain what that is, the auditory phonetic method involves analytical listening. In other words, you're listening to the speech samples and analyzing them by ear in terms of a variety of different parameters. This isn't like ordinary listening, the sort of listening that you're probably doing to me at the moment and I'm doing to you, where we're listening to the content of the speech, i.e. what's being said. We're listening to how it's being said. And within the auditory phonetic tests, we attend to the following parameters of speech. We would be looking at how the individual consonant sounds and the individual vowel sounds are pronounced, and we'd be comparing that across the samples. So, for instance, we might be looking at how the T sounds, the T consonants are pronounced, how the L's, the M's, or whatever are pronounced. And in order to do that, we've got a much sharper tool than the Roman alphabet, which we all used to read and write with, which it wouldn't really do the job. So that we would use the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is an extended system of symbols and notations that help you capture the fine-grained nuances, the details of pronunciation, and we'd compare those across the samples, across the two recordings. We would also be listening to the prosody of the speech, in other words, the speech rhythms, where the major stresses fall. We would be looking at the rate of speaking, the rate of articulation, which we might be measuring in terms of syllables per second. We'd be looking at the intonation of the speech, which is the rise and fall of the pitch of the voice across utterances, in other words, the melodies of the speech. We'd be attending to the voice quality, or the timbre, as I've referred to it. In other words, what sort of voice is it? Is it a creaky voice? Is it a breathy voice? Is it a harsh voice? Is it a nasal voice? Is it a denasal voice? Is there evidence of tension in the larynx when the person speaks? Do you get that sort of effect? Is the larynx being raised or lowered? We would also be looking at the tongue-body orientation, whether it's further forward or further back in the mouth. And to carry that out, we would use a scheme, University of Edinburgh developed a scheme called VPA, Vocal Profile Analysis, which has in it 38 different settings. So we'd be scoring the samples in terms of whether they were creaky and just how creaky they were, breathy and just how breathy they were, and we'd be assigning them a breathiness score, a creakiness score, a nasality score, a score in terms of raised larynx or lowered larynx, and so on and so forth. And within this scheme, there are 38 different, the version of the scheme we use, 38 different settings. So collectively, the examinations of the voice quality, the timbre, the intonation, the prosody, the individual vowels, the consonants, the rate of speaking, they make up the auditory phonetic tests, the analytical listening tests that we do. In addition to those, there's a second group of tests which are known as acoustic tests or instrumental tests. And nowadays, these are computer-based tests which involve using specialized software to measure things such as the average voice pitch, which is measured as what we call fundamental frequency. And this refers to the rate at which the vocal cords, the two strips of muscle within the larynx, are vibrating when a person speaks. So that's estimated by the computer program and averaged over a series of utterances and compared across the samples. We'd also be looking at the acoustic resonances within vowel sounds and looking at where they, at the frequencies at which they occur, the so-called formants. And we would be creating overlay graphs to overlay the values obtained from the questioned recording, the criminal recording, with the recording of the known suspect. We'd be looking at where the main energy loci were, in other words, where the main focus of the energy was, with consonant sounds such as P, T, K, and S and Sh. In addition to these sorts of things, and so they would be the acoustic tests, which involve measuring physical parameters of the speech signal by a computer program. In addition to that, we would also be taking into account things such as individual speaker habits, such as lip smacking, that sort of thing. Patterns of, whether there were any patterns of disordered breathing between utterances. We would be looking at things such as hesitation markers, the so-called ums and ers of speech, the sort of sounds that people make when they're hesitating. We'd be analyzing those by ear and by computer program. We'd be looking at how people simplify speech by missing out or eliding sounds when they're speaking, and whether the patterns of elision were the same across the two samples. And in addition to which, we'd also take into account broader linguistic factors, patterns of term taking in conversation, whether people used filler sounds such as ain't it at the end of utterances, or like, or sort of, or that sort of thing. And really, we'd be looking at a whole range of different parameters of the speech signal, and also taking into account this broader linguistic information. Now, with screaming, just virtually none of that is available to compare with the normal voice. You could derive it from the normal voice of the suspect, but if the criminal sample, or the alleged criminal sample, involves screaming, the sorts of features that we focus on are just not there for comparison.
You have lots of ways to identify specific characteristics of voice, it sounds like, including speech pattern, accent, unusual defects and such. But sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, there was just something I should have added into that in analyzing speech on all of these parameters, what we're looking for, of course, are individual identifying characteristics. In other words, personal peculiarities, things that mark that speaker out from other members of the relevant language community. So what the idea of departures from the norm is pretty central to doing this work. And of course, that presupposes that the analyst knows what the norm is, not just for the language in question, but for the particular accent or dialect that they're analyzing. Now, of course, if somebody's yelling, you can't usually tell, or if they're screaming particularly, you can't tell, in fact, what the accent of the dialect is, or whether there are any departures from the norm, any idiosyncrasies.
When you talked earlier about there being no specific length of speech that's necessary, does there have to be enough speech that carries some of these markers that would allow you to find these individual specific identifiers?
Yes.
So while it may not take 2 or 3 minutes, there has to be enough speech of whatever length for you to perform this analysis?
Yes, and critically, it has to be speech, not screaming.
Well, how much screaming would it take in order for you to be able to do this?
Well, it depends how extreme the screaming was. I think if the screaming can I move on to the specifics of this case?
Certainly.
If the screaming in this case had been for several minutes, net screaming, I don't know, maybe even half an hour, I don't think you could come up with the result it's not something which you can specify in terms of length, because if it went on and on and on in exactly the same way as the few seconds that we've got in the recording in this case, it wouldn't be in the least helpful. It wouldn't allow us to move to a conclusion, no matter how much of it there was.
Thank you, Dr. French. I guess the idea that you're talking about, though, presupposes that you have a sample for comparison. And does that sample for comparison need to be the same or similar? And in screaming or yelling circumstances, especially when someone is under high duress or life-threatening situation, are you able to get a reasonable exemplar?
No, generally speaking. If somebody's in genuine distress and they're an extremist, you wouldn't be able to get a reasonable exemplar. And the other thing is, of course, even if you could, I'm not sure what you would do with it, because we don't have any real idea of the degree of individual variation in these, if you like, distress cries, real distress cries. We don't know how different people are from one another when they produce them. I mentioned the PhD student who's carried out work in this area. She's working on a very small number of examples simply because, you know, recordings of that type are comparatively rare. And the problem is that it may be that one person screaming out in those circumstances could sound like others, even though the patterns are unpredictable. You could get happenstance correspondences. It's really uncharted territory, this. It's something which hasn't been, and it's very difficult to adequately explore in any meaningful way because of the dearth of data on it.
Are you saying there's just no reliable research and data that would allow you or anyone you know in the scientific community to do a reliable voice comparison based on screams?
Yeah.
And would that include the audio recording in this case?
Yes, it would, and it would also hold true irrespective of what method of analysis one would apply to it.
You have, of course, listened to the recording that is the subject of this proceeding, the cries for help, or however you would characterize them, in the background of the 911 call, and have had an opportunity to form an opinion whether you think that recording is suitable for forensic analysis. Is that correct?
Yes.
Let's just have you speak to that specifically, and what is your opinion specifically about the evidence in this case?
My view in this case is that that recording isn't even remotely suitable for speaker comparison purposes. If it had been submitted to my lab just for that by a prosecution agency, it wouldn't have even got to first base before rejection.
You would have refused to conduct an analysis beyond determining its suitability?
That's correct, yes.
If you go ahead and do it anyway, do you increase the risk of whatever your findings are being confusing or misleading? Or can there even be findings?
I don't think there can be any, well, there can't be any meaningful findings, no. I mean, I've never heard of it being done before, and I think there are very good reasons for that.
Have you explained those so far? Are there additional good reasons why you wouldn't undertake a voice comparison under these circumstances?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up with regard to the methods that we routinely use in the lab. There are other methods, of course. We have here a biometric system, which we are not fully employing in casework yet, but which we are testing, we're carrying out research on, and I have some experience of such systems. And you couldn't get a meaningful result out of a comparison using a biometric system either.
If you were to attempt to do a biometric analysis of a voice sample such as this, what would the methodology or the approach be to this type of analysis?
Well, I mean, firstly, let me say you just wouldn't do it. The biometric systems are not designed to do this yet. They're designed to compare reasonably good quality samples of people speaking in modal voice with modal voice. By modal voice, I mean normal voice. They're not designed to do this at all. If someone were to do it, despite that fact, the first thing that you would do would be to test the system. So that, for instance, in this case, you wouldn't simply put in the yelling from the 911 call and test that against Zimmerman. You would want to know whether the system could perform in these circumstances. In other words, what you'd want to do is, if it's a closed population of only 2 people, Zimmerman and Martin, you'd want to test it against Martin. And if it rejected both of them, and it could only be one or the other, then you would know the system didn't work. That would be a basic test. However, you would want to do much, much more than that. You want to, I suppose, try and get people to emulate this very, very high level screening. It'd be difficult to do. Don't quite know how you do it to make it realistic, but you'd want to have a number of subjects, I don't quite know how many, talking at normal levels and also screaming at very high levels, and you'd want to test the system to see whether it could actually marry up the screamers with the normal voice of the person who'd done the screaming. So you would test the system at some length, and you would also want to calibrate the system to set the thresholds, and they would have to be established as being appropriate to the data. However, I mean, I would just say it's an absolutely foregone conclusion what the results of this would be. If the system were adequately tested, you would just find out exactly what we already know, and that is that the system is not designed for doing this, and it won't work in these circumstances.
If one didn't go through that methodology and gave it a try anyway, would you expect the results to be in any way reliable or of any value in a forensic setting?
No. I mean, the methodology, as I've described it, is the methodology. And I think you would have to, in this case as well, draw a distinction which I'm not aware of having been drawn so far, which is between the technology and the methodology. The methodology being the set of methods or the procedure followed, the technology being, if you like, the software, the automatic system, the biometric system. And sorry, go on.
In this case, you're not, as you talk now, you're not speaking specifically of the software employed in this case, the Easy Voice Biometrics. You're talking generally about biometric voice comparison software?
Yes, I am. I mean, generically, biometric voice comparison software is accepted with various caveats within the wider scientific community. There are people who don't believe it should be applied in the forensic context, but generally speaking, it's an accepted technique for comparing voices. It's used in various jurisdictions across the world. That's the technology. The methodology is something separate from that. The methodology is what the set of methods somebody follows in a particular instance. And whilst you could say the technology employed in this case by Mr. Owen, for example, is accepted, well, the general sort of technology, I can't speak about the particular system itself, but that sort of technology is accepted, leaving aside the issue of easy voice. But the methodology utilized would not be accepted within the wider scientific community because of lack of testing of the system and also various other things that have happened. For instance, the reduplication of material, so that initially the sample was rejected on the basis of it being too short. So what the analyst had done was actually to repeat it, to reduplicate it, to loop it, to double its length just by repeating it. In other words, to fool the system in believing that the sample that was being put in was actually longer than it was. So, I mean, that would not be an accepted methodology within the wider scientific community. And the artificial raising of pitch in the reconstruction exemplar recordings until it was like the pitch found in the actual screams from the 991 call, I mean, that would be a totally novel methodology to my knowledge as well. That wouldn't be accepted within the scientific community.
Dr. French, you mentioned that you employ various methods, methodologies in your voice comparison work. You've now talked briefly about the computer software approach. Are you also familiar with the oral spectrograph approach?
Just before we come on to that, I should perhaps mention that I don't know of any laboratory that would only use the biometric approach, the ASR approach. People who use that tend to use it, well, in fact, use it together with analytical listening or some other form of testing. So, for instance, my laboratory, in considering whether we're going to adopt the particular system that we're trialing at the moment, wouldn't be adopting that as an alternative. The sort of testing that I've already described to you in some detail, which is the auditory phonetic come acoustic approach, it would be integrated within that. It would be simply one test within that much wider battery of tests that I've outlined to you. The oral spectrographic approach, I'm not entirely sure what this is. It's not something which is, if it involves the old-fashioned voice printer approach, the discredited voice printer approach, which is the holistic, non-analytical comparing of spectrograms, a sort of rough picture matching with some listening, then really I wouldn't condone the use of that in any circumstances.
Have you had an opportunity to review the report of Dr. Alan Reich?
I have.
And are you able to, from that and any other testimony you may have heard, understand what his methodology and approach was on the voice comparison component of what he did?
Yes, it seems to be it bears some similarities to the one that I described, which is the auditory phonetic come acoustic phonetic approach. If you wanted to call it aural plus spectrographic, I guess you could, but there are differences between the voice print tradition and what I've just described, and I think Dr. Reich is nearer to the tradition I've just described than to the voice print tradition.
Did you say that the voice print analysis is no longer in favor?
Well, it's never been used in the UK, and I don't know of any serious speech scientist anywhere in the world who would condone it.
Is there such thing as a voice print?
No.
Would you explain that a bit, please?
Well, if I were to say the same word, I don't know, 1,000 times into a recorder, and you were to do a detailed acoustic analysis of each production of that word, and to look at the spectrograms of it, you would never find that there was an exact match. I mean, it's a bit, I suppose, an analogy that the court might appreciate would be something akin to handwriting. Let's say you or I were to produce thousands and thousands of signatures across lots and lots of sheets of paper. If you were to examine them in enough detail and compare them, you would never ever, even if I produced them from now until the day I die, find an exact pair. And so it is with speech, that each acoustic event, each speech event is actually unique. So it's not like there are things in the voice which are, there's an underlying pattern which is immutable and which remains constant from occasion to occasion. That's not the case. Even if things are produced on the same occasion, the same word, they differ from one another. And of course, within the voice print tradition, there are no criteria for what counts, how similar something has to be before you count it as an instance of looking the same, or how different it has to be before you count it as different. It's all, there's no real theoretical underpinning at all to the voice print approach.
For someone to use that analysis in this case would, if I understand you correctly, place too much reliability on a method that's been shown not to be reliable.
It's not even reliable with normal speech, let alone what we've got in this case.
We were speaking of Dr. Reich's work. You seem to have some reservation or maybe even some confusion about what it was he actually did. Are you able to speak any more as a speech scientist and someone in the both academic and forensic scientific community about his analysis?
Yes, there are a number of things about it that I find disturbing. One is, well, for instance, the examination of the screaming, and a word which I think most people either can't interpret or hear as help, he hears as the word stop. And what he's done is to look at the constituent resonances of the vowel of that scream, which he says is the ah vowel of stop, and to look at the lowest resonance, the lowest formant, and to suggest that that is 10% above the average for an adult male. Now, if we, and then to go on from there to say, well, because, yeah, point is that the shorter the vocal tract, the shorter the space between the larynx and the lips, the higher that that value is going to be. He suggests on the basis of that, because it's 10% higher than he would expect it, that the screamer has a 10% shorter vocal tract than one would expect, and therefore this is consistent with it being Mr. Martin, because he is in his late teens, and therefore you would expect him to have 10% of his growing to do, and that would include 10% of the growing of his vocal tract. Well, I mean, there's no way of establishing a direct correlation between the amount of growth somebody has to do and the value of the vowel formants, the vowel resonances. And the other thing is, if we look at most of the studies of shouting, they all report an increase in the frequency of the first resonance, the first formant anyway. So I find that very disturbing, and I can't see any basis for that claim whatsoever.
More to that for a moment, if I might, Dr. French, for clarification. Are you saying that there is no accepted literature, no accepted method in the scientific community to identify a speaker's age by the frequency that Dr. Reich has described under the circumstances? I'm sorry.
There is no accepted methodology within the scientific community for identifying a speaker's age from the constituent resonances from the formants of them screaming. No.
Do you think that a 29-year-old in a life-threatening situation may vocally be able to make that sound?
I think a 50-year-old would.
So that's not age-related at all, in your opinion?
No. The first formant, the lowest resonance, increases in frequency with the opening of the mouth. And when people yell, their mouth is generally much more open than it is when they're speaking normally.
Dr. French, do you have training in phonetics? Are you a student of this area of study?
Yes.
I know you mentioned earlier that you are a PhD have a PhD in the analysis of recorded conversation, but that you also have a degree in linguistics with phonetics.
Yes, my PhD was not on phonetics. It was on conversation analysis in classrooms. But my postgraduate training was very much in phonetics. I've also trained since then under various other people at different points in my life in different aspects of phonetic analysis, and I'm called on to train other people.
Doctor, I cut you off. There was a second part to your explanation, I think, regarding Dr. Reich's claim that he could associate that last word that others have said is help, that he thinks he can say is stop, with Trayvon Martin. You said that his connection with Trayvon Martin's age and his explanation of Mr. Martin having maybe 10% more growth to do is simply not founded in science. And the second part, were you talking about screams in particular, or did I cut you off?
No, I was looking at his comparisons of what he says are speech in various points in the background of that recording with speech in a known recording of Mr. Zimmerman. In particular, utterances which he hears, such as "these shall be" or "there shall be," "let me up," "get off me," you want to help me here," "get down," "whatever," "stop," and not a single one of those can I hear as speech. I think probably they're a combination of things such as breathing, random patterns of noise in the background of the recording, and once you can listen to them and think, ooh, doesn't that sound a bit like whatever, or doesn't that sound a bit like you want to help me here, or some of these are screams, some of them are just I can't accept that any of those are speech.
Is there a recognized phenomenon in your area of study how people might misinterpret noise or other artifacts into speech, especially under extreme amplification?
I'm going to object, Your Honor. This is well beyond the scope, as well as outside the witness's stated expertise as far as phenomenons or psychiatric diagnoses.
I don't know that the question asked for psychiatric diagnosis, but I'm going to overrule.
Are you able to address that, Dr. French?
I'm able to address it from two aspects. I shan't trespass into the territory that your opponent has just mentioned. There's a very substantial body of work by Dr. Helen Fraser in Australia on looking at how people can misinterpret speech-like utterances and speech in recordings of poor quality, and also from the viewpoint of my own experience, it is not infrequent for people to hear patterns which they believe are speech in the background sounds of recordings.
Is that phenomena recognized and appreciated in the work that you do?
Yes, it is. It's something that we're constantly exercising caution against in our own work, and always we would err on the side of caution.
How might you minimize the effect that the listener may be biased by influence of a predisposition, perhaps, or a preconceived idea of what they think the facts of the case might be, or even that they're hearing real words as opposed to artifacts and noise?
Well, over and above exercising a general caution against it, I don't think there is a way. One thing I would say, though, is if you were simply presented with the screams in this case, with no background information, if they were just edited out of the recording end to end and given to an analyst. I don't even think you could be sure that the person was screaming in English. I don't even think you could be sure that the person was male rather than female. And it's that sort of background information that people use in bringing to bear what's happening.
And how about the ability to, or the claimed ability to identify words from little pieces of information or snippets that have been extracted by multiple levels of amplification, and basically the sub-level of what you can, or I'm saying that very poorly, I apologize. Dr. Reich is claiming to be able to understand speech attributed to both Trayvon Martin and Mr. Zimmerman in the 911 call, and also to Mr. Zimmerman in his non-emergency call to the police. As I understand your evidence, you don't find any of that speech in those recordings.
No, I don't. If you'll just give me a moment while I look at the note. No, I'm just looking at it from the Zimmerman 911 call. First utterance claimed to be, "Do you think I'm crazy here?" Then later on, before, if you'll excuse me, the words "these assholes," "dear God" is attributed to the speaker, and then after those words, "but not on me," and I can't hear any offensive speech.
When you say you can't hear it, did you try through you and your colleagues and your laboratory?
Indeed, yeah.
So you did
I mean,
go ahead.
Sorry. No, the problem is you can amplify them, but they don't become more clearly speech. They just become louder. That's what amplification is. Even if you do selective amplification at different frequencies, it doesn't help you decide what is speech and what is not speech, generally speaking. And in my view, those are not speech.
Thank you, Dr. French. May I have one moment, Your Honor?
Okay.
Should we take a few-minute recess now? I'm about finished, but...
Well, why don't we finish it up and see, and we'll take a recess after we finish with the witness.
Just stand by, please, Dr. French.
Thank you. Mr. Manti?
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, Dr. French, or I guess, is it still morning there?
No, it's 24 in the afternoon, Mr. Manti.
Dr. French, do I understand that despite you having testified over there in England quite a bit, I guess, this is your first tendering or testimony in an American courtroom?
Indeed, yes.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you a little bit, while we were still fresh on the subject of listening to that 911 call and things that you cannot hear on it, you certainly do not hear anyone say anything like, "You're going to die tonight, motherfucker," do you?
No.
Okay. You certainly don't hear anyone say anything like, "You've got me," or anything like that, do you?
No.
All right.
We're talking about which one? The
911 call, the
call.
screaming call, yes, sir.
The screams call, no.
Okay. Nothing like that on that call at all, right?
No.
Dr. French,
I'm not saying that, sorry, if I could just amplify a little bit on that.
Sure.
I'm not saying that there's nothing on there that could, with a bit of imagination, be construed as things like that, but I can't see anything, I can't find anything on there which I would hear as those things.
let me ask you just in general terms about the amount of effort or physical energy needed to produce the sounds that you heard as screams from the distance, and I understand you're familiar at least with some of the basic facts that these were recorded at some distance away, even from the outside of a building in which the telephone recording them was located. You familiar with those facts in general?
Yeah, my understanding is it was maybe about 40 feet, am I right, from the screaming to the telephone?
From the outside to the inside of, I guess, an apartment, or?
Yeah, yeah.
And sort of, I guess, in competition with the voices of the other folks that can be heard on the tape.
Yes, sometimes the screaming is in fact overlapped by the speech of the caller or the speech of the operator.
So tell me a little bit about how much sort of effort or power would be required to kind of generate anything to be audible at all at that distance and given those conditions.
Well, you can't really address that because it would depend on a number of factors. It would depend on whether the screamer was, their mouth was facing towards the apartment where the telephone was situated, or whether they were facing away, or whether their head was at right angles to that. It would depend on whether or not at a particular moment the person who was making the call had the microphone of the mouthpiece of the mouthpiece of the telephone pointing towards the scene, or whether it was pointing in the different direction, how close she or he had the telephone handset to their face, a whole range of things like that. And it would also depend on the quality of the line, the particular connection between the telephone and the control room where it was recorded, and the equipment in the control, so on. I mean, so there's a heck of a lot of variables there really to take into account, and I don't think I could give any meaningful view on how much effort would be required.
Let me ask you about some of the physical variables involved, and by physical I mean the person producing the sound that we interpret as a scream. Did you detect anything there that would suggest that that was being smothered or interrupted or anything like that?
Couldn't tell you either way.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the answer.
I believe you said you couldn't tell us anything about that either way.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
Yes, a lot of it was overlapped with, I'm just looking at, if I can just refer to it. Wait a minute. Yeah, most of it was actually overlapped by the speech of one of the other people, the operator on the caller. The vast majority.
Do I understand you to be telling us that the evaluation of forensic samples like this is, in general terms anyway, a valid undertaking? In other words, you and the folks at your lab routinely at least attempt to analyze forensic samples.
Yes, we do analyze forensic samples, yeah.
And I think you mentioned that you do not advocate or specify any bare minimums in terms of the amount of words or the duration of the signal or anything like that.
That's correct, yes.
You did say that you need much less of that sort of thing for elimination purposes potentially than for inclusion.
Yes, in certain circumstances, if you, for instance, let's say your voice were the voice in a criminal recording, and my voice was the recording of the suspect, you would need relatively little, maybe just a few syllables, so long as there was no indications that there might be voice disguise present to eliminate me as the suspect.
Doctor, has anybody indicated that you're in any way the suspect? My understanding, Dr. French, is that your examination of these included listening to these samples repeatedly, listening to the edited version of it, meaning the screams have been pulled out, so listening to those by themselves, looking at the formant frequencies, measuring the fundamental frequencies, and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
You also listened to it being played on different programs, like, for example, one of them was Sony SoundForge, right?
Yes, I listened to it, I think, on two programs only, Sony SoundForge and Pratt, which is University of Amsterdam system for sound, excuse me, speech analysis, which has become more or less industry standard.
And SoundForge does sort of what? You actually, not only do you listen to something using SoundForge, but you can also see things from SoundForge.
Yes, you can. It's a bit of a blunt tool compared with the other one, Pratt. Normally, the default display would just be the waveform. So in other words, you would see, you would have a time amplitude display on the screen as you were listening to the sound. So you could tell, looking at that sound, by looking at the extent of the positive and the negative deflections of the waveform, whether the sound you were listening to was louder or quieter than adjacent sounds, excuse me, and you could also tell, you could measure the duration of it, but there is some potential for doing spectral analysis within it, but compared with the other program, as to say, it's a bit of a blunt tool.
My understanding is that when you measured the pitch in this case, at least for the stuff where there was no overlap, you characterized the range of 350 to 900 hertz, which I think is a very, very high pitch. Am I right?
Yeah, could I, sorry, just give me a moment.
Sure.
Yeah, I think I may have recalculated this material with the assistance of the person who did the PhD specifically on screaming, because it's very difficult to do pitch estimation based on screaming, and she developed a particular technique for doing that within the context of her doctorate. So the figures are a little different from those that I gave you in deposition. If I could give you the new ones, the average pitch in that material was estimated to be 526 hertz. The maximum was estimated to be 843 hertz, and the minimum 342.
And that's as for her data?
No, that's as for the screams edited out of this recording.
Okay, so you recalculated the data for the screams edited out of this. Why'd you do that? Just
simply because what I'd done in the first instance was just to use the default program within the piece of software that I mentioned, Pratt, whereas the person who'd done the PhD had developed within that PhD various techniques for adjusting the pitch to get rid of errors, because it's not designed really, no softwares, it's speech analysis software is not designed for measuring things in screaming, and therefore it's prone to make errors. So what she developed was particular ways of coping with and eliminating those errors. So I reran the analysis with her assistance using those particular techniques, and got some new figures, which are not very different from the original ones, but a little bit so.
So you went back and used additional, I'll call them resources for lack of a better generic word to use, and came up with a slightly different conclusion than you had just basically a week ago. But
that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Nothing scientifically strange or unsound about that. That's just sort of you want to improve your data, right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, it wouldn't have actually materially affected my view, but it's better that it's done as correctly as possible.
Would you say it is a distinction without a major difference?
Yes.
Okay. You don't think it's something just because you happen to change something moderately or mildly within a week or so that scientists ought to be concerned about in terms of validity?
Sorry, could you just expand a little bit?
The fact that you changed something to hopefully improve your result isn't something that should concern a scientist. It's something scientists should encourage.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, what became clear was that there was a slightly better resource, a slightly more accurate resource than the one I'd originally used for taking those measurements, yeah.
Okay. And when I asked you before, if I were to try to summarize what you've told us, my question was then, if I try to summarize what you've told me, it's essentially your quibble is not necessarily which process gets applied, but that this particular sample, none of the processes should be able to draw you any conclusions whatsoever.
Yes, there are two concerns really. One is that none of the processes are able to draw you any meaningful or reliable conclusions, and there's also an issue with the methodology itself in relation to one of the processes, namely the biometric one.
When you say the methodologies, you're talking about whether or not these. Let me be a little more specific. The methodologies that you've described, whether it is the biometric approach or the auditory acoustic combination approach, neither of those by itself in concept is problematic, but your opinion is that they should not be applied to samples like this.
No, that's not quite right, actually. Well,
Okay.
yeah, one thing is neither of them should be applied to samples like this. The other problem is with the biometric one. I think what we need to do and what the court needs to be aware of is a distinction between, on the one hand, technology and on the other hand, methodology. So whilst the concept of biometric technology is accepted within the broader scientific community, the methodology employed by Dr. Owen would not be accepted within so it's the methodology itself employed by Dr. Owen, Mr. Owen, which would not be accepted within the wider scientific community. So it's not just the application of it to these data, it is the methodology itself in relation to the biometric approach used here.
Let me ask you about the discussion regarding the vocal tract measurement and the possible correlation or possible non-correlation. Do I understand you to say that you really can't draw any correlation between the age of a person and the overall pitch of their voice?
When they're screaming.
Okay. In general terms, would you say that younger persons who have not either completed puberty or physically finished developing will have a higher pitched voice than they will after they've finished?
Yes.
So that's certainly
People who haven't undergone the voice change, men and women, if they haven't undergone the voice change, generally speaking, they'll have a higher pitched voice than when they have.
Thank you, Dr. French. If I could have just a moment, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
That's all the questions I have, Judge.
Thank you. Any redirect? Mr. West?
Dr. French, this is Don West again. With that last subject, can you talk a little bit more about when the voice changes? Let's talk about men. Let's talk about men. When the voice changes, what is that process, and when in life does that typically occur?
It would typically occur in the early to mid-teenage years. I'm not a specific expert on that, but generally speaking, within between the ages of, say, 12 and 15, 16, maybe even a little bit older in some cases. And what happens is the lowering of the larynx, the enlargement of the larynx, the enlargement of the sinus cavities, and this creates changes to both the quality of the voice and to the pitch.
Is it also, the time when the voice changes, is it also associated with other physiological changes in the body?
Well, generally with puberty, yes.
And what are you familiar with the kinds of physiological changes that are typically associated at the same time that the voice changes?
My memory is that long, yes.
For example, facial hair or pubic hair, those kinds of things typically associated with physiological changes in this stage?
They are. I'm just becoming a little concerned, Mr. West, that I might be straying outside of my area of expertise.
Sure.
And giving, if you like, information that the average judge or juror, trier of fact, would themselves be able to answer just as well as me.
Certainly. Would you know from would you know from information that you have whether Trayvon Martin had undergone this change from puberty through puberty to where his voice would have changed?
My general impression is that he had, although it would be very difficult to actually ground that in the recording I had, because most of that was on raised voice and some of it was just high-pitched vocalizations.
Are you talking about the recording of Trayvon Martin's voice that was the soundtrack of a video?
Yeah, 2 video clips.
Is that the only voice that you have, that you know of, that may contain Trayvon Martin's voice?
It is, yes.
I have no other questions.
No, thank you.
Dr. French, we're finished with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. French.
Disconnect. Thank you.
We're going to sign off now.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take your morning recess for now. How much time do you need? Get set up for your next witness.
Oh, just a few minutes for that purpose, or whatever the court's pleasure is for a break for the staff.
We'll take a 15-minute recess.